All right, a little bit of a hiccup there on my end, folks. One of the beauties of doing any of these design programs or design-oriented tasks is always to troubleshoot. So that is a giant, really, really cool lesson to always remember to troubleshoot. And I think that kind of makes you more of an expert. All right, so without further ado, all right, let's jump into diving a little deeper into a really neat feature here on Illustrator, which I find really fascinating. So if you're familiar with the Adobe Illustrator Classics 3D version, you probably know that in the past, maybe you had a little bit of a hard time sort of showing the progress in real time. So if you want to see the 3D Classics and you've used it in the past and you've found some really cool experimentations there, then cool, give it another go. It's still there. It's still available. In the meantime, today we're going to actually pull up the new interface for the 3D and materials. So some really cool stuff here. I have set up a backdrop on my end that is going to be really helpful for us to be able to explore this a little bit better, right? So I have here still some of the familiar elements that we are used to on the 3D Classic. So I have here a plane, which allows us to kind of place items. Let's use maybe this guy over here. It allows us to place items in a plane view. So either on a surface plane, right? So either something horizontal, something vertical, or maybe at a diagonal isometric view. So you can see there how easily that does that. And you can have an ability to play with the different rotations and different viewpoints of that plane. Cool. And now that one is also coming from our 3D Classics, which we may or may not be used to. And then we also have extrude, and extrude is really neat because right away it just makes this sort of 3D Rubik's Cube effect that we're so accustomed to. And that's also really helpful for in general, even if you don't want to transition into something that is super 3D view, but you just want to create a bit of depth within your illustrations or maybe your logos. All depends on what you like to use it for. So we do have the ability to use extrude on this, and you can see how cool it is that like it really makes those changes in real time. And that makes a huge difference. Those are huge gains on Adobe Illustrator's ends. And I'm really excited to work on this because it means I can start to dabble a little bit on Adobe's 3D and material elements that are very familiar, are going to be very familiar if you jump into those bigger, more professional programs devoted specifically for 3D, like Substance or Dimension. So this is going to be a really cool intro view into that. All right, so let's jump into Revolve. Revolve is a really neat one too. We had it before. Revolve is going to give you this sort of 360 option. So it goes all around. Really cool, right? Now you have the ability to just kind of cut that sort of like a pie. Starts to cut. And that creates just different shapes for you. Now, what's really neat about all of these elements is that you are still able to modify them. So for example, in this case, if I want to modify this element, let's just close it for a second. I can just double click within the shape and you can see there, my shape is a triangle. And I want to actually make this shape a little bit rounder on the edges. And you can see there, that just creates a little bit of a cleaner look on my shape. And of course I can like modify it back if I want to, or select one of these elements and only modify the bottom. And I'm creating this really cool, maybe like a plate, and you just let your imagination run wild on that end. And you can experiment quite a bit with this one. I actually think I'm gonna keep those edges on either side and see how that appears. Nice. Really cool. And we haven't done anything here that is too heavy for the computer. And I'm going to explain to you a few things that I've learned in my workflows to be able to still maintain some a workflow that's going to work for my computer right now. We don't all have these monster computers, and so 3D can be a bit I guess scary if you don't have the right hardware. But if you follow the steps and follow this workflow, you're going to have an easier time. And that's what I found in mine. So let's see here. One of my favorite ones that is brand spanking new in Adobe Illustrator's 3D and materials feature is inflate. And it has a little balloon there on the right-hand side, kind of neat. And you can see right away, as soon as I make inflate, it kind of gives this optical illusion that my shape is actually 3D and it's circular. So it gives these really neat shadows and lights on it, and it gives it that inflate mode. So that is a little bit different from these elements that really do reflect a 360 3D view. This one's kind of more of an illusion of that. So keep that in mind in case you do want to export these elements as 3D. Just keep that in mind, because I notice that is something that I'd rather have completely as 360, or maybe sometimes I just want to play with the illusion of 360. So I'm going to make a shape here on this one. Actually, right away, if you are familiar with some of my work, you probably are familiar with my logo, which is just a letter C, but it's really neat because you get to play with all the different spaces. One of my favorite things about the Adobe Creative Cloud is it's always inviting you to play with mixed media, right? So I'm going to actually make a revolve on this element. And one of the things that you can do, you can see this view right now is specifically facing us, right? So we can do a custom rotation, or we can set it to, for example, top. We can set it to isometric left. And let's see, what if off-axis front looks like? And I think this is the one that I want, off-axis top. So I'm going to offset this just a little bit there, so I can have a counter, sort of like the letter O now has a counter, and I just created a brand new typeface in just that element. And we started with a rectangle, a vertical rectangle, which is kind of interesting. How did I form a circle out of that? But it's just using this this sort of settings can allow you to kind of play with the viewpoint. Okay, so then we have the offset there, and using revolve, we're going to just remove a little bit. And already I'm creating this really neat C shape. Now, another thing I want you to see again is how I can modify this element by changing the transform, right? I'm just playing with the edges and rotating it here. And you can see it becomes another element in itself, right? So now I'm going to undo that. If I actually want to go up here and make it bigger and scale it, you can use shift on that end and scale it. You can also use the letter S, and that's going to then select the object inside of it and scale it. That's pretty cool. I think I'm going to rotate it a little bit more here. I think that's working out well. Nice. All right. So when it comes to this, you'll notice that right now I have these really particular shadows and they look really neat. And I might want to experiment a little bit more. Just gonna rotate it on the y-axis here. Yes, that looks better. And perspective wise, you also have just the ability to dial in those tiny little changes as opposed to going here and being hands-on. But it's all up to you if that is sort of what you like to do. If you like to be hands-on, I like to sort of change things directly on my artboard there. Let's see, on the Z axis, I'm going to rotate it. And there you go. I have my C, which is really neat that I made that out of that shape. And now I'm going to jump into this really exciting part, which is the materials section within the 3D materials, right? So the 3D materials, you'll notice it defaults to the base material. And if we go in here a little bit more, you notice that there's some really cool presets. And what's very interesting about these presets is that they derive from the Substance 3D programs. So these presets are always going to have like this sort of parametric abilities, which means I can always change the colors, the attributes of these elements. And I've gone ahead actually and downloaded a few from the community assets, which allows me to download some really cool materials. I mean, look at this labyrinth wires, just looks really, really cool. Some a little bit more simple than others. I actually downloaded this plain plaster ceramic salmon. That is one really long name. That's a mouthful. Okay. So this, of course, it's created by several artists, and you can have the ability to create your own as well. And you can think of these as patterns. I think that has been the best way I've been able to digest it, because just like patterns, you're able to repeat them quite a bit or reduce that repeat. So I'll show you an example. So if I was to apply this element here, this is a bit of a marble element, a little bit of grease in here. And when I apply this, you saw how fast that was. That was really fast, right? When I apply this, I'm able to also see it here within my properties. And if I don't like it, I can just trash it and I can move on to a different element and try to apply that. And so I'm going to also trash that one because I don't like that one. I think I'm going to go with this really neat one. It's called cheese. All right, cheese it is. So we're going to go down here and we're going to start to see some different parameters. We see the resolution, we see the repeat, which is much like patterns, right? How often do I want to repeat this? So I can repeat it a lot less, which means that patterns, it's a little bit bigger within that space, or I can repeat it a lot bigger. And you can start to see those little textures of cheese in there. And if I want to change that, I can apply the same thing to a different material here, and you can see how that repeat changes the look of it. Right now it starts to look a little bit more like fabric, and I don't really see the little delicate, I guess, the pattern within it. So you're able to see it a little bit in a smaller way. I like this one too. It has that marble floor. And again, I downloaded these from that community Substance materials. So definitely feel welcome to do that. It's going to be really, really fun once you get a hold of that. And so I'm going to go in here and actually increase this repeat, and it looks a little like that. Okay, cool. Now let's move on to lighting, because lighting, I think, has this really cool sensibility that you can just change. Tiny changes can make a big difference. Okay. So for example, if I want to diffuse this lighting, or I want it to come from a different direction, top left, top right, I can create some intensity in this as well. All right. So we have a little bit of intensity here, and I can also rotate the lighting so that it hits different areas of my work. Nice. Okay. And one other neat feature within this element here is that I'm also able to create a shadow. So now the shadows, it depends on you, right? You can also create your own artificial shadow. Sometimes it does such a good job at like being part of my element. I like to place it below the object. I notice that does the best for me. So I can determine the distance, and I can determine the shadow bound. So you can start to, maybe I'll bound it up to there, right? So when it comes to shadows, I like to have a lot of control over the shadows, and this gives me a little bit of control, not exactly the maximum. So you can be very peculiar about this. It might be just what you need, or you can, just remove it, and that doesn't have to be included, which is kind of neat there. So now that I've created a light condition, now I can also modify the color palette of that light condition. So for example, if I wanted to make it more of a warm environment, right? Like something like that. And that starts to kind of apply to that. Now we can decrease that intensity a little bit of that ambient light. And also, of course, choose maybe a lighter color that goes a little bit closer to that warm white. And all this while, you just see how fast these changes are made, which is fairly interesting for me because it's a bit cumbersome to be working on these elements and sort of waiting it out. And this is very real time. So that gets me really, really excited. Another part of this is that it's starting to imitate real 3D programs. Of course, we have them within our Adobe Creative Cloud family. So a lot of these elements are going to be incredible because you get to dip your toes into this space and hopefully jump into the bigger, masterful, professional dimension of Substance Adobe programs, right? And so you'll see here, much like there, we have the render with ray tracing. So what this does is it basically creates the AI creates a really realistic viewpoint of all the different selections you've made down to the lighting, right? So now, the workflow part that I mentioned earlier is very important because that workflow is going to be vital for you to do all of these different property changes and wait till the very last minute, okay? Especially if your hardware is not necessarily up to par for this. You can still dive into 3D materials without worrying about it. Just reserve that render with tracing towards the end. And that's going to be very important. Another element about this is you have options. You can render it low. So let's do a low render, right? Cool. You can see a little bit of changes there. We can also render it medium and we can also render it high. And what's really cool about this is that you see now kind of more of a 3D essence to my file. And here's another example. I'm going to just use this and I'm actually going to pick up this gradient here. Cool. That's a really neat gradient on my 3D, what was it? We did revolve on this one, right? Revolve. So really neat. You can start to see all the different light changes on this one. And it really reflects a bit more because maybe the patterns give it a little bit more of a obstruction, but this is a gradient. So you can test that out there. Look at the diffuse lighting, really cool, right? So now when I render it with ray tracing, you're gonna see what a change it makes. Now you can determine more intensity. Now that you've selected ray tracing, of course, it's gonna be very particular to every change that you make. So you might wanna turn it off and continue to make your changes along the way, so that you don't have to sort of make the computer lag a little bit. I'm gonna do it on this guy here. Let's select our gradient and do a ray tracing. And you can really tell how it picks up those textures within this sphere. And we can also use a material, for example, this really neat fabric, and it traces right away. And you can see how fast that was. And even if it's not, as fast as this, depending on your capabilities, it will still be much faster than what we're used to with Adobe Creative Classic. And that opens up is so much room for you to play around and experiment on the go without any specific focus. And that can give you so much room for growth. All right, let me try one last. Let's try that cheese again. Ooh, that looks more like a baseball. So let's reduce that repeat. Really awesome. And those checkers. I'm starting to look like a really cool disco ball. And if we apply some of these different patterns, you can start to see how neat they become. I like creating, for example, a shape that can allow me to just experiment a little bit more with some of these elements. For example, this is a different shape than I'm used to, and I'll just grab the revolve and you can just see how it modifies that quite a bit. So I'm going to bring that in and bring that down also. And look, that changed my shape altogether. So transforming it will also give you more room for different types of facets of your shapes, your 3D shape. So I'm going to add a final material here, and I think I'm going to choose this really cool orange one. Wow, so that creates a really neat wood sort of material to it. I'm going to select it and check. Awesome. So we created some really neat materials here along with a 3D logo version of my letter C, which is awesome. Some typography experimentation. And I think we are a little bit more versed in the 3D and materials in Illustrator, and I hope you learned some really cool, neat tricks today. And I encourage you to experiment. So for now, this is all for me. Definitely join me on Discord and hang out with me a little bit more so we can chat on all the possibilities of Adobe Illustrator 3D and materials. And till then.